Dax Renshaw leaned against his workbench, eyes flicking to the notification on his datapad. Delivery received, finally. He'd been waiting weeks for this. With a sigh, he pushed off the bench and crossed the cluttered space of his home workshop, boots clanking against the metal flooring. Outside, the sky of Eon 7 was its usual deep indigo, twin moons casting pale light over the jungle-covered hills beyond the colony's perimeter. He barely noticed. The delivery crate was taller than expected, almost his height, with a sleek metallic sheen. The shipping label flickered with his order details. One top-of-the-line robotic maid, pre-programmed for domestic tasks. Exactly what he needed. He wasn't the social type. A machine was simple, reliable. No conversations, no misunderstandings, no human mess. Dax keyed in the unlock code. The crate hissed as the vacuum seal released, the lid sliding open with a smooth mechanical sound. He peered inside and froze. A girl stood in the crate blinking up at him. Not a robot. Definitely not a robot. She had deep violet skin, silver eyes that caught the moonlight, and bioluminescent markings glowing faintly along her arms. Her short, silken hair shimmered between shades of blue and black as she tilted her head. The tight, dark fabric she wore was unlike anything from human manufacturers, more organic than synthetic. And she wasn't moving like a confused android. She was watching him, studying him just as much as he was studying her. Dax's pulse kicked up. He had no idea what he was looking at. "Who the hell are you?" The girl didn't answer immediately. She stepped out of the crate, bare feet touching the cold metal floor. Her glowing markings pulsed faintly like a breath. "This isn't," she started, her voice smooth, careful, "where I was supposed to be." Dax took a step back, mind racing. This had to be a mistake. "Yeah, no kidding. I ordered a damn robot." She arched a delicate eyebrow. "I'm not a robot. Clearly." They stared at each other in silence. Dax ran a hand through his dark, unkempt hair. This wasn't happening. This was some bureaucratic screw-up, some ridiculous accident. He reached for his datapad, fingers flying across the interface. The order confirmation was there. The shipping logs. Everything said his robotic maid had been delivered, yet here was this alien. He looked up. She was still watching him, too calm, not afraid, more like assessing. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Zyrah." Not a name he recognized from any known colonies or races. His jaw tightened. "All right, Zyrah, start talking. How the hell did you end up in my shipment?" She glanced at the crate, lips pressing together. "It's complicated. I like simple." "I can't give you simple." Dax exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. He didn't have time for this. He just wanted his damn robot. Zyrah's eyes flicked toward the open door behind him, scanning the darkened jungle outside. Her shoulders squared slightly, tension creeping into her posture. Dax caught it immediately. "You're running from something," he said flatly. Her silver gaze snapped back to him. She didn't confirm it, but she didn't deny it either. Dax crossed his arms. "Listen, I don't know who you are or what kind of trouble you're in, but you're not my problem. I'm calling colony security and they can deal with this." He turned toward his console. A second later, a sharp crack filled the air, followed by a rush of movement. He spun, instincts flaring. Zyrah had moved fast, faster than human. She stood between him and the console now, her stance firm. "No," Dax tensed. "Excuse me. You can't call them." He narrowed his eyes. "You want to explain why?" Her glowing patterns pulsed again, a subtle shift in the dim light. "Because if you do, I won't be safe." "Not my problem." She studied him, her silver eyes searching his face for something. "You don't trust people," Dax scoffed. "That obvious." "Yes." He didn't like how easily she read him, didn't like any of this, really. Zyrah exhaled, tension still coiled in her frame. "Just let me stay the night," she said finally. "One night. I'll be gone by morning." Dax hesitated. Every part of him screamed to throw her out, let the authorities handle it. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't someone who got involved in things that weren't his problem. That was why he moved to this colony in the first place. But then there was the way she stood there, poised yet weary. The way she kept glancing toward the dark beyond the door, like she was expecting something worse to come through. He sighed sharply. "One night," he muttered. "That's it." Zyrah nodded, relief flickering across her features. She stepped aside, allowing him to move past her. Dax locked the door behind him. He had a feeling this was going to be a long night. Dax didn't sleep. He sat at his workbench, pretending to tinker with an old drone while his mind ran in circles. Zyrah sat on the far side of the room, perched cross-legged on the floor like she belonged there, like she wasn't some mysterious alien who had appeared in his shipment by mistake. Except it wasn't a mistake. He knew that now. She wasn't confused. She wasn't lost. She had put herself in that crate on purpose, and she was hiding something. Zyrah didn't seem the least bit concerned about her situation. That unsettled him. Most people, hell, most humans, would be panicked if they were stranded on an unfamiliar colony with no resources and no allies. But Zyrah, she was watching him, her silver eyes tracking his movements with quiet curiosity. Dax tightened a bolt on the drone chassis, knowing full well it didn't need tightening. He was restless. "You keep staring at me," he muttered, not looking up. "You keep watching me," Zyrah countered. He huffed. "Because you're in my house." She tilted her head slightly as if considering. "It doesn't feel like a home." Dax's hands stilled. He finally looked at her. "Excuse me," she gestured vaguely at the space around her. "Everything is cold, precise, organized for function, not comfort. No warmth. No signs of life." Dax frowned. "I live here." She studied him for another beat, then simply said, "You exist here." He clenched his jaw. "Thanks for the psychoanalysis, but I didn't ask for it." Zyrah shrugged. "It's just an observation." Dax turned back to his drone, irritation prickling under his skin. He wasn't about to let some random alien girl judge his living situation. He liked things the way they were, controlled, predictable. No mess, no chaos, no people. But now he had her. Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the occasional whir of a cooling unit and the distant hum of nocturnal creatures beyond the colony walls. Finally, Zyrah shifted. "You didn't ask me why." Dax flicked his gaze to her again. "Why what?" "Why I hid in the shipment." He set down his tools, exhaling sharply. "Would you have told me if I did?" Zyrah's lips quirked slightly, the ghost of something amused. "Maybe." Dax leaned back in his chair, arms crossing. "Fine, I'll bite." "Why?" She hesitated, her glowing markings pulsing faintly, a subtle rhythm beneath her skin. Then softly, "Because I had nowhere else to go." Dax didn't respond right away. He expected something more cryptic, some vague half-truth like before. Instead, her words felt raw. He studied her carefully. "And who were you running from?" Her expression shifted, the amusement draining away like water through a sieve. For the first time since she arrived, she looked uneasy. "People who want to control me." Dax's brows pulled together. "You some kind of fugitive." Her silver eyes met his, steady. "Not in the way you think." Frustration flared in his chest. She was doing it again, giving just enough to keep him hooked but not enough to actually explain anything. He wasn't in the mood for riddles. Before he could press her, a sharp sound cut through the air. A beep. Dax's head snapped toward his console where a notification pulsed on the screen. Incoming transmission. His stomach twisted. He hadn't sent out any calls. Zyrah stood abruptly. "Don't answer it." Dax's fingers hesitated over the controls. "Why not?" Her voice was firm. "Because it's for me." The words sent a chill down his spine. He glanced at the console. The signal wasn't coming from the colony network. It was an encrypted frequency bouncing between relays. Someone had tracked her here. Dax clenched his jaw. "You led them here." Zyrah's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't mean to." The transmission request repeated, a quiet but insistent beep. Dax had a choice. Answer it and risk exposing himself to whatever the hell Zyrah was tangled up in, or ignore it and stay in the dark. His fingers hovered. He looked at her. Who is it? She didn't blink. If you answer, you'll find out the hard way. That was all the warning he needed. Dax shut off the console. The beeping stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Zyrah exhaled, tension in her shoulders easing slightly. That was the right choice. Dax leveled a glare at her. You don't get to decide that. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. No, but I know what happens when they get their hands on someone. A slow, uneasy dread crept through him. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what that meant. Instead, he just exhaled sharply and pushed to his feet. This is a mistake, he muttered, pacing toward the window. His reflection stared back at him against the darkened glass, the jungle beyond eerily still. I should turn you in. Zyrah's voice was quiet. You won't. His grip tightened against the windowsill. You sound pretty damn sure about that. I am. Dax turned back to her, irritation flaring again. You're awfully confident for someone who has no leverage here. Zyrah stepped forward, the bioluminescent glow along her skin shifting subtly, a slow ripple of light. You could have called security the moment you saw me. You didn't. That was before I knew you had people looking for you. Still, you had the chance to turn me in just now. She tilted her head, eyes sharp and unreadable. But you didn't. Dax didn't have a good answer for that, and Zyrah knew it. She took another step forward. You don't trust people, she murmured, repeating her words from earlier. But you also don't turn your back on someone in danger. Dax scowled. You don't know me. Zyrah just held his gaze, unblinking. Not yet. The air between them felt charged, something unspoken threading between the lines of their conversation. Dax exhaled roughly and scrubbed a hand over his face. I'm gonna regret this. Zyrah's lips curled slightly. Probably. He shot her a glare, then turned back to his workbench. He wasn't sure what the hell he'd just gotten himself into. But one thing was clear. He wasn't getting rid of Zyrah anytime soon. Dax had spent years avoiding complications. People were messy. Problems were messy. That's why he preferred machines. Predictable, efficient, easy to fix when they broke. But Zyrah was none of those things. She was an unknown. A problem he couldn't just reprogram or throw out the door. And now, because of one stupid decision, he was in her mess. He sat at the console, fingers drumming against the metal surface. The transmission alert hadn't returned, but that didn't mean whoever was searching for Zyrah had given up. If anything, they were probably closer than before. Zyrah leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, watching him with that unreadable expression of hers. She had barely moved in the last hour, as if waiting for something. Dax finally broke the silence. If they tracked you here once, they can do it again. She nodded, unsurprised. Yes. Then you need to leave. Now. Zyrah's gaze didn't waver. That won't solve your problem. Dax narrowed his eyes. My problem. They already know someone refused their transmission. They'll assume you're involved. A slow, sinking realization settled in his gut. She was right. Whether he wanted to be or not, he was now part of this. Dax muttered a curse under his breath. So what, you expect me to just help you? Zyrah pushed off the wall, stepping closer. I expect you to survive. Something about the way she said it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He crossed his arms. Why are they after you? For a long moment she didn't answer. Her glowing patterns pulsed faintly as if she were weighing her response. Then finally she said, because they think they own me. Dax frowned. That's not an answer. She exhaled, looking past him toward the dark jungle beyond the window. I wasn't born, I was made. Dax's breath caught. Zyrah's silver eyes flicked back to him. Not in the way humans create machines. My people were engineered, designed for a purpose. Dax's mind reeled. There had been rumors of bioengineered species, corporate-backed experiments, artificial evolution, but nothing confirmed, nothing real until now. You're a prototype. The words left his mouth before he even processed them. Zyrah's lips twitched slightly. I was supposed to be. Dax sat back, running a hand through his hair. And let me guess, whoever made you wasn't thrilled when you decided to take off. Her jaw tightened. I wasn't given a choice. I was property. Dax stared at her. He wasn't the sentimental type, but something about that word, property, rubbed him the wrong way. He'd worked for the corporations once, before he'd had enough. Before he'd left that life behind, moved out here to the colonies where no one could tell him what to do. Zyrah wasn't just running. She was escaping, and now they were coming to drag her back. Dax blew out a breath. Great, so now I've got some corporate goons inbound who think I stole their science project. Zyrah arched an eyebrow. Technically, I stole myself. Dax shot her a look. That's not making me feel better. She took another step forward, the faint glow of her markings casting soft light against the metal floor. You don't have to be involved in this. Dax barked a humorless laugh. Oh, sure. I'll just tell them, hey, I have no idea what's going on. Please leave me alone and they'll definitely believe me. Her expression softened just a fraction. I didn't mean to drag you into this. Dax exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Yeah, well, too late for that. He pushed away from the console and started pacing. He needed to think, needed to figure out his next move. Running wasn't an option. If Zyrah's pursuers were good enough to track her here, they'd find her again. And now that Dax had interfered, they'd be looking for him too, fighting. Also a terrible idea. He was good, but he wasn't stupid, which meant their only real option was deception. Dax stopped pacing. We need to make them think you were never here. Zyrah watched him carefully. How? He turned to his console, fingers flying across the interface. First, we wipe the colony's tracking logs, erase any record of your shipment arriving. Zyrah moved beside him, watching as lines of code scrolled across the screen. And after that, Dax glanced at her, we make it look like you died. For the first time, Zyrah looked genuinely surprised. He smirked. You're engineered, right? Let's see if we can fake a corpse. Zyrah's gaze sharpened. You want to fake my death? Dax kept typing, his focus locked on the console. It's the best way to get them off our backs. If they think you're dead, they stop looking. She didn't immediately respond. When he glanced at her, he expected hesitation, maybe even fear. Instead, she looked intrigued. You've done this before. It wasn't a question. Dax smirked. Let's just say I know my way around a digital corpse. Zyrah studied him, the soft glow of her markings casting faint light over her features. You've erased someone before, Dax exhaled. Not exactly, but when I left the corporate world I had to make sure they'd never find me again. Same principle, just more permanent. She tilted her head slightly, considering. And how do you propose we do that? Dax finished his line of code and leaned back. Step 1. We fabricate a distress signal. Make it look like you ran into trouble outside the colony walls. Step 2. We leave evidence, something that confirms you didn't survive. Zyrah's lips quirked slightly. You say that like you already have something in mind. Dax smirked. Ever hear of a void wolf? Her expression shifted. I've heard of them. Dax stood and stretched. Good. Because we're about to make it look like one of them ate you. The jungle was dense, humid, and completely silent. A bad sign. Dax crouched beside a cluster of thick vines, scanning the area. The void wolves hunted in these parts, big, reptilian predators that stalked the colony perimeter, striking at anything that wandered too far from safety. Their venom dissolved organic matter fast, leaving behind nothing but remnants, which was exactly what they needed. Behind him, Zyrah moved with effortless grace, her silver eyes scanning the darkness. She was barefoot, her movements so quiet they barely disturbed the ground. Dax had seen trained soldiers make more noise. You do this often? She asked. Dax smirked. Fake deaths? No, lure out predators. Sometimes. She didn't seem convinced. You know an awful lot about hiding from powerful people. Dax didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a small, pressurized vial. It was filled with synthetic pheromones, engineered from actual void wolf scent markers. Zyrah arched an eyebrow, and that is, Dax gave the vial a little shake, a dinner bell. With a flick of his wrist, he cracked the seal and tossed it several feet away. The vial shattered on impact, releasing an invisible mist into the air. Within seconds, the jungle felt different, tense. Zyrah's bioluminescent markings pulsed subtly, like her body was reacting to the shift. "They're coming," Dax nodded. He wasn't planning to stick around when they arrived. "Now we leave." He grabbed Zyrah's wrist and pulled her back through the thick foliage, retracing their steps toward the colony perimeter. They needed to be gone before the void wolves found the bait. They moved quickly. Dax's boots crunched against the undergrowth, but Zyrah barely made a sound. It was eerie how naturally she blended into the shadows, like she belonged there. They were only 100 feet from the colony gate when a deep, guttural snarl broke the silence. Dax stiffened. Zyrah didn't move. Another snarl, closer this time. The air felt charged, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. Then, from the darkness, two golden eyes blinked open. Dax barely had time to react before the void wolf lunged. A blur of dark scales and gnashing teeth, faster than anything that size had a right to be. Dax was already reaching for his pulse rifle when Zyrah moved. She was a flicker of motion, too fast, too smooth. In an instant, she pivoted between Dax and the creature, her hands glowing with energy. The void wolf lashed out. Zyrah caught its snout with both hands. For a single breath, everything was still. Then light surged from her palms. The void wolf howled, a deep, unnatural sound that rattled Dax's skull. It writhed, its massive body twisting in pain. But Zyrah didn't let go. Her markings pulsed brighter, her expression locked in quiet focus. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. The void wolf collapsed, dead. Dax stared. Zyrah exhaled, standing over the corpse. "That was close." Dax blinked. "That was insane." She turned to him, expression unreadable. "We should go." Dax swallowed. "Right." They left the carcass behind, moving swiftly back to the colony. But something gnawed at the back of Dax's mind. Zyrah had just killed a void wolf with nothing but her hands. What the hell was she? Back at the colony, Dax's mind was still reeling. He had seen some crazy things in his time. Rogue AI, black market augments, cybernetics that could rewrite biology. But nothing like this. Zyrah wasn't just engineered. She was something else, something dangerous. And now she was standing in his living room, calm as ever, while he tried to process what the hell just happened. Dax set his pulse rifle on the counter and turned to face her. "You want to tell me what that was?" Zyrah tilted her head. "You already know," Dax exhaled. "I know you're not human. I know you're engineered. What I don't know is how you just melted a void wolf's brain with your bare hands." She considered him for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Then, finally, "I was designed to be a weapon." Dax wasn't sure why, but hearing her say it out loud made something twist in his chest. A weapon, not a person, not even a failed experiment, just a tool built to destroy. He should have known. He should have figured it out sooner. And yet, when he looked at her now, standing there in his cluttered little home, she didn't look like a weapon. She looked tired. Zyrah moved past him, settling onto the edge of the worn-out couch. "They built me for control. A biological failsafe, something that could eliminate threats with absolute precision." Dax leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "And you weren't interested in being their pet assassin." She met his gaze. "Would you be?" Dax didn't answer. He didn't have to. She sighed, running a hand over the faint bioluminescent lines on her forearm. "They underestimated me, thought they could build a mind without giving it will." Dax frowned. "And now they want you back." Zyrah nodded. Dax exhaled sharply. This was getting worse by the second. "If these people are as powerful as you say, faking your death might not be enough." She watched him carefully. "You're afraid," Dax scowled. "I'm concerned." Zyrah gave him a look that suggested they both knew that was a lie. He pushed off the counter, pacing. "We still follow the plan. We plant the distress signal, make it look like you got taken out by that void wolf. But we'll need more than just a digital record." Zyrah raised an eyebrow. "Such as," Dax thought for a moment, "biological evidence. Something they can analyze and confirm your death without needing a body." Zyrah's markings pulsed subtly. "That might be possible." Dax paused. "Explain." She hesitated, then held out her arm. "I can shed organic material." Dax blinked. "You mean like—" A faint hum vibrated through the air. Before his eyes, Zyrah's fingertips shimmered with light, and then, like dust scattering in zero gravity, small fragments of her skin flaked away, dissolving into faintly glowing particles. Dax's stomach turned. "That's unsettling." Zyrah smirked. "It's efficient." Dax shook his head, rubbing a hand down his face. "All right, we can work with that. We mix your organic remains with the void wolf's carcass, make it look like you got torn apart." She nodded. "And then," Dax ran a hand through his hair, "then we disappear." Zyrah's gaze lingered on him. "We—" Dax hesitated. He hadn't meant to say it like that. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the truth. He was already in too deep. Even if they pulled this off, the moment the corporation suspected anyone had helped her, they'd start digging. And eventually, they'd find him. Zyrah studied him for a long moment. "You don't have to do this." Dax exhaled. "Yeah, well, I don't like loose ends." A flicker of something passed through her expression, something warm. She didn't thank him, didn't say anything really, but she didn't have to. For the first time since this whole mess started, Dax felt like they were in this together, and that scared him more than anything. The plan came together fast. They planted the distress signal outside the colony perimeter, broadcasting a scrambled SOS that made it look like Zyrah had been attacked. Dax spliced footage from his drone to create a believable, chaotic encounter: shaky cam, guttural snarls, blood splatters. And then came the final piece, the evidence. Zyrah stood in the dim glow of his workshop, her hand outstretched as those strange, glowing fragments of organic material drifted from her skin. Dax collected them carefully, mixing them with the void wolf's saliva sample and a few shreds of clothing they'd staged at the attack site. It was convincing, too convincing. Dax stared at the mess in front of him, the fabricated remains of a woman who was standing just a few feet away. It felt wrong. "You all right?" Zyrah asked. Dax exhaled. "Yeah, just—" he gestured at the setup. "It's eerie, that's all." She gave him a small, wry smile. "I imagine most people don't fake deaths for a living." Dax huffed a laugh. "No, not exactly a marketable skill." Zyrah stepped closer, watching his face carefully. "You don't have to go through with this." Dax met her gaze. "Yeah, well, I'm a stubborn bastard." Her lips quirked slightly, but there was something else in her expression, something softer. For the first time since they met, she looked uncertain. Not about the plan, not about her escape, about him. Zyrah wasn't used to people choosing to stand by her. To stay when walking away was the easier option. Dax wasn't sure what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. Instead, he grabbed his gear and gestured toward the door. "Come on. Let's make you a ghost." The colony perimeter was quiet when they reached the drop site. A single outpost drone hovered in the distance, scanning for anomalies, but Dax had already looped its signal. As far as security was concerned, there was nothing unusual happening. They worked fast. Zyrah scattered the last of her organic traces among the wreckage, while Dax planted the final tampering codes into the colony's records. A false confirmation report would ping the security database within the hour, just enough time for them to be long gone before anyone could ask questions. As Dax worked, Zyrah stood at the edge of the clearing looking out at the vast jungle beyond. "You ever been past the outer rim?" she asked. Dax glanced at her. "Once or twice." No reason to go out there unless you're desperate, Zyrah hummed. Then I guess I'm desperate. He finished his last bit of coding and closed the interface. We both are. She turned to him, her silver eyes searching his. You don't have to come, Dax snorted. Yeah, we've established that. But she didn't drop it. This isn't just running away, Dax. If we do this, we don't come back. Ever. Dax knew that. Hell, he'd spent his entire life avoiding attachments for exactly this reason. But somehow, despite every survival instinct screaming at him to cut and run, he couldn't leave her. Maybe it was because they were already too tangled in this mess together. Or maybe, just maybe, he wanted to stay. He looked at her, really looked at her, and made his choice. Then we don't come back. Zyrah's gaze flickered, something unreadable passing behind her expression. And then she smiled. Not the small, cautious smirk she usually wore. Not the sharp-edged deflection of someone always ready for a fight. A real smile. It was gone in a second, but Dax had seen it. And damn, if it didn't make this whole crazy plan seem worth it. They slipped through the perimeter undetected, vanishing into the jungle before the colony's false report even hit the system. As far as the world was concerned, Zyrah was dead, and Dax, well, for the first time in his life he wasn't just running from something, he was running towards something. And he had a feeling it was only the beginning. The jungle swallowed them whole. Thick canopies loomed overhead, blotting out the artificial glow of the colony in the distance. The further they walked, the more the hum of civilization faded, replaced by the whisper of unseen creatures and the rustling of alien foliage. Dax led the way, keeping his pulse rifle slung but ready. Zyrah followed close, her movements eerily silent, too smooth, too controlled, like she belonged out here. She probably did. You sure about this path? Zyrah asked. Dax adjusted his pack. Only one that doesn't get us shredded by drones or picked up by scavengers. Zyrah hummed, glancing up at the treetops. They'll start looking soon. Yeah, Dax muttered. I know. They needed distance. Fast. The moment the colony logged her death, security forces would comb through every angle, looking for inconsistencies. If any of the wrong people caught wind of an anomaly, especially her kind of anomaly, it wouldn't take long before they were being hunted for real. Dax had planned for this, mapped out routes, emergency caches, possible escape points, but none of that accounted for her. For the way she moved, like she had some unspoken connection to the world around her. For the way she watched him, like she was still trying to solve some puzzle he didn't even know he was a part of. They walked in silence for nearly an hour before Zyrah spoke again. You never asked what I am. Dax didn't look at her, didn't need to. She studied him. Most people would, Dax sighed, kicking a stray vine out of the way. Most people would have sold you out the second they saw the price tag on your head. She didn't argue. The bounty was ridiculous. Enough to buy a whole new life in some luxury orbital, free from the grit of colony work. And yet Dax hadn't even hesitated. Zyrah didn't know what to do with that. She fell quiet, processing, and for a while they just moved. Then a rustle. Dax froze. Not wind. Not the usual ambient noise of the jungle. This was intentional. Zyrah was already turning toward the sound, eyes narrowed. We're not alone. Dax had his rifle up in a second, scanning the tree line. How many? Zyrah's pupils dilated, expanding unnaturally, adjusting to the dim light. 3. No, 4, Dax cursed under his breath. Scavengers, or worse, mercenaries. He shifted his stance, tracking movement in the shadows. Think they saw us? Zyrah's eyes gleamed. They smelled us. Well, that wasn't ominous. A low voice cut through the trees. No sudden moves. Dax tensed. The figure that stepped into view was clad in patchwork armor, scuffed, dirty, but reinforced in all the right places. A scavenger, all right. Not corporate, not bounty hunters, just opportunists looking for an easy haul. Didn't mean they weren't dangerous. Hell are you two doing this far out? The scavenger asked. Dax kept his expression neutral. Hiking. The man snorted. With a rifle, Dax shrugged. Big animals out here. The scavenger's gaze slid to Zyrah. His posture changed, just slightly, just enough. Dax knew that look, that moment of realization. Whatever software was running through this guy's augments, it had just flagged Zyrah as something valuable. Zyrah saw it too. Dax barely had time to process before she moved. 1 second she was still. The next she was in motion, faster than any human had the right to be. A blur of energy, a snap of bone. The scavenger collapsed before he even knew he was dead. Dax fired on instinct, dropping the second attacker before they could react. The jungle erupted in chaos. Shots rang out. Zyrah spun, twisting between the remaining two, her movements fluid, inhuman. A blade flashed, someone screamed. Dax took out the last one with a clean shot to the chest. And then, silence. Dax exhaled, heart hammering. Zyrah stood among the bodies, her hands streaked with a bioluminescent shimmer. Her breathing was steady, too steady. Dax swallowed. That was, he trailed off. Zyrah tilted her head. Necessary. She wasn't wrong. But damn if it didn't shake him a little. Not the fight, not the bodies, her, the way she handled it. No hesitation. No doubt. A weapon. Exactly what they made her to be. She caught him staring and something flickered in her expression, something almost regretful. Dax forced himself to move. We need to go. Now. Zyrah nodded, wiping her hands clean. Agreed. They didn't look back. As they disappeared into the jungle once more, Dax couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just seen a glimpse of the real Zyrah, and he wasn't sure if that should terrify him, or if he should trust her anyway. They traveled through the jungle for days, pushing farther from the colony's borders, deeper into the wilds. Each night, Zyrah's presence lingered in Dax's thoughts, and each day they fought the urge to stop. Dax knew the dangers of staying put, but the deeper they went, the more he sensed something shifting between them. It wasn't just the physical strain of surviving the unknown, though that was starting to take its toll. It was the quiet moments they shared, the unspoken understanding between them. Despite everything, despite the danger and the lies they had to live with, Dax wasn't sure what he felt anymore. Zyrah had been built for a singular purpose, but somewhere along the way, she'd become more than that, more than the weapon she was designed to be. She wasn't just surviving. She was adapting. And damn it, she was letting him in. Maybe she had no choice, but Dax wasn't so sure. The jungle was vast, but eventually it narrowed into a canyon that twisted through the landscape like a scar. It was an odd choice to shelter in. It wasn't exactly a natural haven, but Dax had a plan. They needed to move off the grid, and this canyon was far enough from the nearest outpost to buy them some time. The air was thick with moisture, and the walls of the canyon were slick with moss and dark, creeping vines. They found a small alcove halfway through, just large enough to set up camp. Zyrah moved as if the canyon was her home, never hesitant, never lost. Her enhanced senses tracked everything, from the distant sounds of the jungle to the subtle shifts in the wind. "You've been here before," Dax said as he unpacked their supplies. She glanced at him, her gaze piercing. "You don't think I'd just leave without a plan?" He couldn't argue with that. They settled in, building a small fire, though it was barely enough to ward off the chill that had settled in the air. The firelight flickered, casting shadows across the jagged rock walls. Dax watched the flames dance, but his mind kept drifting back to her. Zyrah sat across from him, sharpening one of her blades. The sight was hypnotic, the motion so precise it almost looked effortless. "Tell me about your past," he said quietly. Zyrah's eyes flickered up to meet his. "My past? Yeah, before all this." He gestured vaguely toward their surroundings. "Before you became this." Zyrah didn't answer right away, her fingers still working the blade. Finally, she spoke, but her tone was flat, detached. "I was never anything else." Dax felt the weight of her words settle into the space between them. He wasn't sure how to respond. "I don't understand," he said softly. "You are more than that." Zyrah's gaze softened, and for a moment he thought he saw something flicker there, maybe regret, maybe longing, but it was gone before he could be sure. "I was made to kill," she said, her voice a quiet echo. "That's all. They didn't give me a name, didn't teach me how to feel or how to love. They built me to serve a purpose." She looked down at the blade in her hand as if it was the only thing in the world that made sense to her. Dax leaned forward slightly. "Then what happened?" Zyrah's eyes met his. "I realized I didn't want to be just that." Dax's heart skipped a beat. There was something raw in her voice, something he hadn't expected, vulnerability, maybe even fear. The idea that someone, something so powerful, could feel that way, it wasn't just surprising. It was unsettling. He took a breath. "You didn't have a choice in what you became." "No, I don't think that's true anymore," he said, his voice firm. "I've seen you, Zyrah. You're not just a weapon. You're a person." Her gaze softened, but there was a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. She set the blade down beside her, folding her arms. "Why are you so sure?" she asked, her voice low. Dax shrugged, trying to keep his tone light. "Because I've seen you fight for your life, and you're doing it because you want to live." Zyrah's gaze lingered on him, measuring him with a quiet intensity. The silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Finally, she spoke again. "You've put yourself at risk for me." Dax didn't look away. "Yeah, I have." Her lips curved ever so slightly. "Why?" He hesitated, feeling the weight of her question settle deep in his chest. It was easier to talk around it, to focus on the immediate survival. But right now, under the dim glow of the fire, with the jungle closing in around them, he knew he had to answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because I don't believe in running away anymore." Her expression shifted, a flicker of something softer crossing her face. They sat in silence for a while after that, the only sound the crackling fire and the soft hum of the jungle. Eventually, Zyrah broke the quiet. "Tomorrow we push north. We can't stay here too long." Dax nodded, feeling the weight of the next step. But for now, with her sitting beside him, there was a strange comfort in the quiet, something he hadn't expected to find in all of this mess. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough for now. The next morning came with a chill in the air, the dense fog of the jungle hanging low around them. Dax was already awake, the weight of the previous night still lingering in the back of his mind. The conversation with Zyrah had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, what answer he expected from her, but her words had left an imprint. It wasn't just about survival anymore. He wasn't sure when he started wanting more than just running, more than just being a pawn in the system. But somewhere between the wreckage of the colony and the canyon they were hiding in, things had changed. They packed quickly, no words exchanged. There was a quiet understanding between them. There always had been, but now it felt heavier, more tangible. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was familiar. As they moved through the canyon's narrow path, the weight of the jungle began to press in. It felt like the walls were closing in around them, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick moss underfoot. Zyrah led the way, her senses alert as always. Dax followed close behind, his pulse rifle ready but held low. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, looking for any sign of movement, any threat. They had only traveled a few hours when they heard it, the distant whine of a drone. Dax's heart skipped. He froze, his hand instinctively going to the weapon at his side. Zyrah had already stopped, her eyes narrowing as she searched the sky above. "Too close," she muttered. Dax looked at her, his stomach twisting. "How do we get rid of it?" Zyrah's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't." She was already moving, her footsteps quick and silent. She gestured for him to follow, and Dax didn't question it. They veered off the path, slipping into the thicker underbrush where the trees grew taller, their branches tangled together like a natural barrier. The drone whined again, closer now. Dax's breath caught in his throat as they ducked low, hiding behind a cluster of boulders. He tried to steady his heartbeat, forcing himself to focus. They had no choice but to wait. Zyrah's posture was alert, her eyes scanning the sky. She didn't say anything, but there was a tension in her shoulders, a quiet readiness that spoke volumes. Dax wasn't sure how long they stayed hidden, time slipping away as the drone circled overhead. Every now and then its engine cut out, only to roar back to life as it swept further away and then returned. The sound seemed to echo through the canyon, bouncing off the walls, but they stayed still. Finally, the drone shifted course, moving further out toward the outer rim of the jungle. Zyrah let out a quiet breath, her body visibly relaxing. "Close," Dax muttered. "Too close," she replied. For a moment there was only silence between them. Dax felt the weight of it, the way everything was pulling him in two directions. He wasn't sure what his life was anymore, wasn't sure what it was going to be. He didn't know if they were going to survive the next few days. But in that moment, sitting with Zyrah, hiding from the world, it didn't feel impossible. He'd never imagined himself being here. He'd never imagined himself caring, but here he was. Zyrah looked at him, her silver eyes softening just slightly. "We keep moving," she said quietly. Dax nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They moved again, but now there was a new sense of urgency. Zyrah didn't lead the same way. She took him toward the heart of the jungle, where the thick foliage offered cover but also concealed whatever dangers lay in wait. Dax followed, knowing that every step they took was a gamble, each choice a thread they were weaving through an unknown future. Hours passed. The jungle began to shift again. The mist thickened, and Dax found himself struggling to keep track of the terrain. They had crossed into denser, more rugged ground, and the sounds of the jungle grew quieter, as if even the creatures knew to stay away. They found a small cave nestled between jagged rocks. It was sheltered, but barely enough to keep them hidden from prying eyes, barely enough to survive the night. Zyrah didn't even hesitate to move in, scanning the area carefully before lowering her pack to the ground. Dax followed suit, setting his gear down with a heavy sigh. He looked out into the darkening jungle beyond. Zyrah stepped to the mouth of the cave, her gaze distant. "We're almost there." "Almost where?" Dax asked. She didn't answer immediately. "Somewhere safe." He felt something twist inside him at that. Somewhere safe, was it possible? Dax wasn't sure. He wasn't even sure he believed in somewhere safe anymore. The world felt broken, his world their world. Zyrah turned to him, a faint hint of vulnerability creeping into her expression. "You don't have to stay, you know. You've done more than enough." Dax looked at her, feeling a weight settle on his chest. "I'm not leaving." Her gaze softened, but she didn't speak. There was something in the way she looked at him that made the weight in his chest feel lighter. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't expectation, it was something else, something new. "All right," she said finally. "Then we wait for tomorrow." As night fell, Dax lay on the rocky ground staring up at the darkened sky. The stars were out now, their cold light shining down on the jungle. Zyrah was still at the entrance of the cave, keeping watch, as always. And for the first time in a long time, Dax felt like he might be exactly where he was supposed to be. The next morning, the air was thick with humidity, and the sun rose high, casting sharp shadows across the landscape. They didn't speak much as they packed up, the weight of the last few days pressing on them. Dax felt it in the tightness of his muscles, the exhaustion in his bones. But it wasn't just physical weariness. There was an emotional drain that had begun to set in, a slow gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Zyrah was different too. He could tell by the way she moved, the way her eyes scanned the horizon. She wasn't just the perfect soldier anymore. She was changing. He had seen it in her before, the quiet shifts in her demeanor, but now it felt more profound, as though a part of her was finally waking up. They trekked northward, following the narrow path that seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them. The sounds of the jungle surrounded them, but this time, Dax couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every rustle of the trees, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of tension through him. They were close now, close to whatever this safe place Zyrah had been talking about. Dax wasn't sure if he believed it would be the sanctuary they needed, but he didn't question it. Not yet. But the unease gnawed at him, and it wasn't just the looming danger. It was the distance that had started to grow between him and Zyrah, emotionally, not physically. She was pulling away as if preparing for something he wasn't ready to face. "You're thinking too hard." Zyrah's voice broke through his thoughts. He looked over at her. "What?" She glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "You've been distracted since yesterday. What's going on?" Dax hesitated, unsure of what to say. The truth felt too raw, too unformed, but he couldn't ignore it any longer. "I don't know what this is," he admitted. His voice sounded rougher than he meant it to, but there was no going back now. "You've been different. I've been different. I don't even know what to call it, whatever this is between us." Zyrah's gaze softened, but there was still a certain guardedness in her posture. She didn't look at him for a long moment, her eyes lost in the distance. When she spoke again, it was quiet, almost reluctant. "We've both been changed by this," she said. "By what we've done, what we've survived. It's hard to understand." Dax felt a pang of frustration. "That's not it. I'm not talking about survival." He shook his head, his fists clenching at his sides. "I'm talking about us." Zyrah stopped walking, turning to face him. "I don't understand what you want from me, Dax." Her voice was almost a whisper, and for the first time in days, there was a crack in her perfect composure. Dax swallowed hard. "I don't want anything from you. I don't want to pretend like this doesn't matter." Her gaze hardened, but there was something soft in her eyes too. She studied him carefully, as if weighing her next words. "We've been through things that most people can't even imagine," she said finally, her voice steady. "But that doesn't change what I am. It doesn't change what I was made to do." Dax's heart ached at her words, but he pushed past it, desperate to be heard. "I don't care about what you were made for. I care about who you are now." Zyrah's jaw tightened. "You don't know me, Dax, not really." He felt the sting of that, but he didn't back down. "Maybe not, but I'm willing to try." There was a long silence, heavy and thick with unspoken words. Then Zyrah took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. For a moment, it seemed as though the world around them had faded, leaving only the two of them in this small space of time. "I'm not a person, Dax," she said softly, the words almost a confession. "I'm a weapon. I was never meant to have a choice." Dax felt his chest tighten, a mix of sadness and frustration rising in him. "Then let me give you a choice." Her eyes met his, and for a moment they were both suspended in that silence. The weight of their shared history, their shared struggle, hung between them, unspoken. Zyrah took another step closer, but she didn't reach out to him. Instead, she lifted her hand, touching her fingers to her lips as though trying to hold back words she wasn't ready to say. The gesture broke Dax's resolve. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand covering hers. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, slowly, cautiously, Zyrah allowed her fingers to curl around his. There was no explosion of passion, no sudden declaration of love, but it was enough. Enough for Dax to feel a small spark of hope ignite inside him. "I won't force you," he whispered. "But I need you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Zyrah's expression softened, the edge in her gaze slipping away. "I don't know how this works," she said, her voice almost fragile. Dax smiled, a hint of warmth breaking through his earlier tension. "Neither do I. But we'll figure it out." They stood there for a long time in the stillness of the jungle, their hands pressed together. And for the first time since they'd met, Dax didn't feel like everything was falling apart. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was something, and it was enough for now. The days that followed were a blur, a slow march toward whatever waited at the end of their journey. Every step felt like it carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, but there was a subtle shift in the air. Something had changed between them, and though neither of them dared to speak it aloud, both of them could feel it. Zyrah had stopped pulling away. Instead, she had begun to open up in small ways in quiet moments. When they camped for the night, she would sit a little closer to him, not saying anything, but there was a gentleness in the way she moved. Sometimes, she would rest her head against the rock wall beside him, her silence no longer a barrier but a comfort. Dax, for his part, found himself more and more lost in her presence. She wasn't just the soldier he had met on the ship or the mysterious, calculating stranger he had been forced to trust. She was becoming something else in his eyes, something that was no longer just tied to the war, to the mission, to survival. She was becoming someone he could care for. That realization hit him harder than he expected, and it both terrified and exhilarated him. One afternoon, as they navigated a dense patch of foliage, Zyrah came to a sudden halt, holding up her hand in a gesture for Dax to stop. He followed her lead, instinctively reaching for his weapon, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" he whispered. Zyrah's eyes were fixed ahead, scanning the dense greenery. "We're close." Dax's heart skipped. Close to what? To where they're keeping it. Dax's confusion must have been clear on his face because Zyrah glanced at him then, her eyes softening. "The place I've been trying to find," she said, voice low. "The place that can change everything. For me, for you." It was the first time she had spoken about the mission in such a personal way, and Dax felt a shiver run down his spine. This place, whatever it was, held answers. Answers that could change the course of their lives. They pressed on, the jungle seeming to close in tighter around them. Dax's mind raced, but he kept his questions to himself. Whatever this place was, he trusted Zyrah. He wanted to trust her despite all the unknowns. They came to a clearing by sunset, and in the middle of it stood a structure unlike anything Dax had ever seen. It wasn't a building. It wasn't a ship. It was a strange fusion of both, like something built by a civilization long forgotten, with organic shapes and metallic surfaces that seemed to pulse with a quiet energy. Zyrah stood still for a moment, her eyes fixed on it, and Dax could see the weight of the moment in her stance. This was it. This was the place she had been seeking, the place that held the answers to her past, to her future. "What is this place?" Dax asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's home," she said, a strange tenderness in her voice. "It's where I was made." The words hit Dax like a punch to the gut. He had known, of course, that Zyrah wasn't from Earth, that she wasn't just a normal human. But hearing it spoken aloud in such a quiet, vulnerable way made everything feel more real, more overwhelming. Zyrah turned to him then, her expression unreadable. "I have to go inside," she said. "This is where I find out who I really am, where I make the choice." Dax felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, but he knew better than to force her. She had to do this on her own. "I'll be here," he said simply. "Whatever happens, I'll be here." Zyrah nodded, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't name. And then, without another word, she stepped toward the entrance of the structure, disappearing into the shadow of the unknown. Dax stood alone in the clearing, his gaze fixed on the entrance. He didn't know how long it had been, minutes, hours, it didn't matter. But when Zyrah finally emerged, the change in her was undeniable. She looked different. Her posture was straighter, her gaze more focused, more assured. She walked toward him with purpose, her footsteps steady. When she reached him, she stopped just short of touching him, as though giving him space to process. "I made my choice," she said, her voice steady but her eyes searching his. Dax swallowed hard, his heart racing. "What does that mean?" "It means I choose this," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I choose us." The words hung between them, and for a moment Dax was struck dumb, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what she was saying. But when the realization hit him, when the truth of it settled in his chest, he could barely breathe. "I choose you, Dax," Zyrah continued, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not just a weapon. I'm not just the sum of what I was created to be. I'm me, and I choose to live." Dax felt something shift within him, something he couldn't explain. He had come to this place seeking answers, but what he found was so much more. He wasn't just standing on the edge of an unknown future. He was standing with someone who had chosen him, and in that moment, everything felt possible. Zyrah reached out, her hand finding his. It was a simple gesture, but it held so much more than just physical contact. It was a promise that, no matter the cost, they would face the future together. "I choose you too," Dax said, his voice thick with emotion. They stood there, hand in hand, staring at the strange structure that had once been the key to Zyrah's past. But now, it didn't matter. Whatever it had been, whatever it represented, it no longer defined her. She had defined herself. And for the first time in their lives, they both understood what it meant to truly be free. Want more thrilling adventures like this? Don't miss out. Subscribe now and join us for brand new stories every day. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next twist in the tale. We've got so much more to share.